Hi, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner. Welcome to tonight's edition of The Robust Opposition. We have a really good show for you tonight. And with me is Liza Tucker, who is with Consumer Watchdog. Hi, Liza. How you doing tonight?
Hi. Thanks for having me, Lauren.
Sure. You've been writing some amazing reports. You're a former journalist. We'll get into that. You're writing the kind of reports that the mainstream corporate media ought to be writing, but isn't. And before we get into your latest report, which is pretty earth-shattering, I want to read your bio so everybody knows who you are. Liza Tucker is a consumer advocate for Consumer Watchdog, following everything from oil and gas to the regulation of toxic substances in the state of California. She comes to us from Marketplace, the largest U.S. broadcast show on business and economics, heard by 10 million listeners each week on 400 radio stations. Liza worked at this public radio show for a decade, first as commentary editor and then as senior editor for both Washington and Sustainability News. At Marketplace, Liza produced and edited several special feature series from Who Funds Washington think tanks to the BP oil spill. Liza has worked as a journalist, consultant, teacher, and translator. So very, very, very professional, well-qualified resume for what we're going to be talking about tonight. First, I want to mention there is a current report that you have out. Then there's an old report from August of 2016 called Brown's Dirty Hands, which we're going to be spending most of the show talking about, in which you showed how he got $9.8 million from oil and energy companies and how it influenced his decision-making. I had not read the report until prior to doing this show. I knew about the $9.8 million. I was always using it, calling him Big Oil Brown, but I really didn't realize how deep it got. And it relates today because of the PG&E and how in bed they are with utility companies. And a lot of people are speculating, it's been in the news, that one of the reasons these wildfires started was because of poor maintenance of the power lines, PG&E's power lines. Do you want to discuss that?
Yeah, sure. This is not new. PG&E had this same problem of trees not being properly trimmed and underbrush not being properly maintained with other fires. So in 1994, there was a blaze. There was a blaze in, I believe, 2009. Then we had the Butte fires in 2015. Now we've got this one. And in all of those instances, the same kind of thing was involved. And in fact, even in one of these instances, I believe in 1994, one of the observations was that about $80 million of the money that was supposed to go into maintaining the trees in the tree fund ended up being used to boost shareholder profits. So this has been a feature of life with PG&E now for a long time, for more than 2 decades. And so it's just not new.
So this article that I read from the Mercury News back in July basically was from an investor call they had with shareholders. And it said that their profits doubled after they raised their bills, their ratepayer bills last January. And now, well, this was in July, they were applying for another rate increase in 2008. But last year, they were convicted on 6 criminal counts for illegal actions relating to the explosion in San Bruno at the refinery. And I want to talk about that, which was caused by shoddy maintenance and lax oversight by the state PUC. And I want to talk about that with you too. The Public Utilities Commission, which is supposed to be regulating these utilities, work hand in hand with them. And Michael Peavy, we'll talk about him. And in this article, they were bragging to their investors on how they had slashed its spending on operations and maintenance by 15%. So let's talk about Brown's dirty hands, okay? Because Jerry Brown goes around the country he goes around the world actually presenting himself as a climate leader. And I used to work for him in 1992. Full disclosure, I was his media advisor in his 1992 presidential campaign when he was actually a progressive. And he supported things like single payer. In fact, he gave an eloquent explanation of why single payer was the only way to go. And now, of course, he's become a complete conservative. And we have been on him in the fracking community, the anti-fracking community, to ban fracking at least since 2012. And he's not been doing it. And we all know now that it has to do with how much money he gets from big oil and the energy companies. So before we get into the specific allegations in the report, why don't you give us the overview of what Brown's Dirty Hands uncovered?
Well, Brown's Dirty Hands uncovered a pattern of donations that were made to various causes and to ballot initiatives and to his political campaigns by 26 energy companies from the time that he was elected in 2011 through the last cycle. And a lot of those donations went to things like the California Democratic Party, and we then also traced monies, something like over $4 million went out of that sum of almost 10 million, went from the companies to the California Democratic Party, and then from the Democratic Party into his reelection campaign. Mm-hmm. And we found that really fascinating. So there were different vehicles. Obviously, you're not supposed to earmark, but it looked a lot like that was going on in terms of some of the timing of the transfers. But, you know, overall, it was donations to the California Democratic Party that somehow ended up aiding him, donations to ballot measures like the one to raise taxes, Prop 30, donations to some of his favorite causes like the Oakland Military Institute and the Oakland School for the Arts. And some of these donations sort of were coming in at critical junctures where the legislature was considering the fracking legislation and then exempted some key ways of fracking from the legislation. And then lo and behold, you know, a big donation would come from one of those companies. So we tracked all of that. And there's in fact a little graph in that study that you can look at that shows you some of the big things that were going on and then some of the donations that happened in close proximity. So that's ultimately what we found. But to speak to your point about Jerry and the Utilities Commission and PG&E in particular, you know, he has a real soft spot for PG&E, and it's a family thing. His late sister Cynthia was married to a top attorney who practiced at PG&E for decades. So you know, there was a straight family connection. His father very much loved a lot of these people and was friends with this Mike Peavy, who is now still, I believe, under criminal investigation for fixing the deal over the San Onofre closure. So, you know, there are deep roots that go back decades between Jerry Brown and some of these people that have to do with the energy industry and with oil and gas. And of course, his own father helped broker, you know, a huge loan of about $10 billion to a consortium of Indonesian banks after the overthrow of Suharno, and he was actually given a stake in an oil trading office where he got paid by the barrel. So you know, the company, the family itself is intimately involved with fossil fuels. That's part of it, part of the story.
Great. Well, I want to go back to the specific things, the specific connections between the donations and his actions. But first, I wanted to talk about, because you touched on the money being funneled through the California Democratic Party. Right. Now, I heard about this when I was working on Kimberly Ellis's campaign, because the treasurer, you know, of her campaign, Hillary Crosby, or maybe that wasn't her title for the campaign, but she was the controller for the California Democratic Party. She basically told me, you know, because the Eric Bauman supporters were like, oh, she's running on this campaign of transparency, and look at this money being funneled, and we're shocked, when in reality, the controller position was pretty much ceremonial. The decisions where the money went to came from John Burton, who was the state party chair. And the other people who knew about this were the Senate pro tem president, who's Kevin DeLeon, by the way, who's running for Senate now, and Anthony Rendon, who was Eric Bauman's boss. So they all knew that this was going on. And how it was done, this is what I find very ironic. This was done intentionally because of something called Prop 34, which was passed in 2000. And I was looking in Ballotpedia here, and it basically was called Campaign Contributions and Spending Limits Act of 2000. And it was supposed to limit the amount of money that an individual can contribute to candidates for the legislature and for statewide elective offices. It also limited the contributions to political parties. It expanded financial disclosure requirements, and it prohibited contributions from lobbyists to the election campaigns of politicians they lobby. Now, it doesn't apply to campaigns for federal office or local office. But here's the thing. In 2010, Sacramento Bee columnist Dan Walters said, quote, "Laundering campaign money to disguise its source is exactly what state legislators intended when they wrote Proposition 34 a decade ago. Its strict limits were designed to give the appearance of reform while encouraging money laundering and so-called independent expenditures so that the candidates wouldn't be accountable to voters for their sources of campaign funds." And in fact, the guy who, who I was going to get another quote here, but I don't. Oh yeah, Ross Johnson, who supported it. He later became the chair of the California Fair Political Practices Commission. Actually said, "I would like to apologize to California voters for supporting Prop 34 and urging them to do the same when it was on the ballot in 2000. Prop 34 has allowed far too many ways for office holders, candidates, and special interest contributors to legally circumvent its contribution limits." So this is exactly in play right now with Wendy Carrillo, who won the primary to replace Jimmy Gomez. The SEIU set up an independent expenditures committee for her, which they contributed to. And also the Women's PAC contributed to that. And the Women's PAC gets money from Chevron and Charter and Indian Gaming and, you know, the Fisher family's logging operations in Humboldt. And Wendy Carrillo can say, "I had no idea," you know, because this is not my campaign. So what do you know about that proposition? Have you done any reporting on that?
I actually have not. All I can tell you is that we were very disappointed in how the Fair Political Practices Commission handled our report, which, as you know, we submitted as a sworn complaint to them. And we also had a list of witnesses that we supplied that we thought would be we knew would be able to confirm sort of who knew what when and all of that. And the FPPC declined to interview those people and then dismissed our complaint. And, you know, it's very insidious when you have a situation where, you know, the appointees are appointed by the governor to the FPPC. And so then how can you get any kind of true investigation or true justice in a situation like that? And it's unfortunate, but I mean, yeah, that is the way it works. And we did see, you know, large sums of money. For example, Chevron donated, I'm looking at, you know, the summary here, $135,000 to the California Democratic Party the very same day that lawmakers exempted a common method of fracking in the state using steam. So, you know, that happened the very same day. Occidental gave $100,000 to one of Brown's causes, you know, just as soon as the moratorium on the fracking permits pending an investigation into the safety of the practice was dropped. You know, Jerry Brown fired two wellhead safety regulators that were trying really, really hard to update rules and actually force companies to follow rules that were on the books and had been for decades, but they had allowed them to ignore. And Occidental Petroleum hired Gray Davis, who, as you will recall, once worked for Jerry Brown in his first administrations back in the late 70s and early 80s, to go to him and pressure for the firing of those two individuals. And indeed, he used a top aide who's now sitting on the Public Utilities Commission, Cliff Rechtschaffen, to do that wet work. And the minute that done, and Occidental got a fracking permit in Kern without an environmental review. They donated $250,000 to Prop 30 to raise taxes. And then they gave another $250,000, 9 or 10 months later. So, you see those things going on. And obviously it's a way to get around the restrictions on the direct donations, which these companies often also maxed out. So this was gravy on top.
I want to say that there were a lot of people implicated in that. I wrote about that. I think I might have mentioned to you that I led the citizens-led campaign against Fran Pavley's bill SB4 back in 2013. It was supposed to be a fracking regulatory bill, but it really didn't do anything to regulate fracking. I mean, if you wanted to regulate fracking, you would have said it should be 2,500 foot from homes or schools. The well casings had to be this thick, that sort of thing. It was a monitoring, disclosure, and study bill. Oh, and a notification. And I had over 20,000 signatures on petitions by Credo and Move On for people who wanted her to withdraw her bill and fight for a ban instead. Correct. And what happened was most of the environmental organizations and Californians Against Fracking were against this bill. There were 4 organizations that still had their name on it. The NRDC, which I think is somewhat of a sellout big green group, a League of Conservation Voters, oftentimes another sellout big green group, Environmental Working Group, and Clean Water Action. And the reason they supported this was so that they could have a seat at the table. And what happened at the end was Brown was ordered by his paymasters in the oil industry to make it so that during the 2 years that the study was being conducted, like we need more studies to show us that fracking is not safe, during that 2-year period, there could be no environmental impact report done on any fracking permits. So essentially, it would allow unregulated fracking for the 2 years. And that's why those 4 groups tried to influence her, use their seat at the table to get her to not accept the amendments. It didn't work, and the bill passed. And over the next 2 years, we found out that the DOGGR, which is the Department of Oil and Gas and Geothermal Regulation, allowed these fracking companies to inject toxic fracking wastewater into our aquifers 2,500 times. In fact, we even protested one of these aquifer exemption workshops where they teach the oil companies how to avoid getting an EPA permit. And it was outrageous. But I remember in my research for that article that he did fire the head of DOGGR and the head of the Department of
Conservation.
Right, which was and that was also because of Michael Rubio, who was a state senator in Shafter, where they do this fracking because the oil companies own Kern County. And they basically told him, so he put the pressure on, Gray Davis put the pressure on, everybody put, and Brown fired him. And these 2 shills that they put in as a replacement just kept, they
went back to the old, they simply went back to what it was prior, which is, look, all these rules are on the books. When they say California has the toughest environmental laws and rules and all the rest of it, that's true. The problem is they're not enforced. And so all these people were trying to do was enforce what was already on the books. They did, it's true, do some emergency regulations to try to make sure that there was more oversight of the integrity of the wells and blah, blah, blah. But that's, really why we ended up with all those injections into those aquifers, because that was one of their beefs, that the companies were going to have to prove that their wells would not leak if you injected into them. Just like with the fracking, that they would have to prove the same thing, not just for fracking, but for the injection of the waste. And that's exactly right. It didn't happen. It was a direct consequence of the kind of people that Jerry Brown substituted those 2 regulators with So it's even worse than just firing them. It's replacing them with the people that then oversaw the destruction of our environment. That's
it's really the fox guarding the hen house. And, you know, it's not only is it Brown and is it Shaft, he was just one of what they call the oily Democrats, otherwise known as the mod Democrats, who get money from, you know, and so that's also why Holly Mitchell had a fracking moratorium bill that very same legislative season that went down to defeat. And those mod Democrats were able to use Fran Pavley's bill as political cover. Oh, I didn't vote for the fracking moratorium bill because I voted for Fran Pavley's bill instead. And as I was told so many times, she's the best friend environmentalists have in Sacramento. Well, you know, if she's the best friend, I would like to see.
Yeah, we're pretty pathetic. I agree with you. I mean, look, Rubio, didn't he take that job as a lobbyist for Chevron?
Yes, he then became.
So basically, yeah. So I mean, you know, it's all. Yeah, it's like this revolving door, Lauren. I mean, that's one big problem. And I don't know what the solution is. You know, I just think it's really shocking, though, that the mainstream media doesn't dig into this and that it's practically impossible to get them to try to really objectively look at the image of Jerry Brown and what he's crafted about himself as this climate change warrior, and then like the reality on the ground. I mean, everything from fracking to cap and trade to trying to build a Western grid, you know, that's like Enron too coming down the pike, but people don't really realize it. And, you know, some environmental groups are, I think, co-opted to a certain degree. I think this whole idea of a seat at the table is often really misguided. I mean, I think it's easy to appeal to some of these groups from the point of view of, yeah, you have a seat at the table and we take you seriously, but then they go ahead and do whatever they want to do anyway in the end, and these groups don't necessarily have that much of an influence. And I just think it's you know, sad that some of these groups go along with that.
I want you to talk about Michael Peavy, Nancy McFadden, who's a close aide of Brown, and their relationship to PG&E, and specifically how SoCal Edison donated $130,000 on the same day Peavy cut a deal to make the ratepayers in San Diego, put them on the hook for the $4.7 billion cost to decommission San Onofre. So talk about that.
Okay, well, okay, you started with Peavy. So Michael Peavy was an electricity broker. He was actually one of the people spearheading the deregulation of electricity. After he had been, you know, he also was the head of Edison. He was the president of Edison. And Gray Davis absolutely loved him and brought him in to basically try to figure out, you know, the problem of what to do in the middle of the deregulation mess. And he was involved in helping pick contracts and negotiate, you know, for power to get us out of all of that. And of course, bail out these utility companies to the tune of billions. I mean, I think the whole thing cost us like $46 billion or something in the end, the whole fiasco, you know, with the Enron ripoffs and everything else, the whole meltdown. So Peavy was, you know, very much kind of in. And prior to that, he'd been a friend of Pat Brown's, and he'd actually started an outfit. I think it was called something like the California Coalition for the balance between the economy, between the environment and the economy. It morphed into something with a different name, but it's an industry-funded group that actually takes people on junkets still. And he did that for Pat Brown for a couple of years. And you know, the irony is that this group, which is now called CFE, CFEE, I can't remember exactly what it stands for. That's how Michael Peavy wound up in Warsaw, scribbling a deal on the back of a hotel napkin with this Southern California Edison executive over how to stick the ratepayers with most of the billions to shut down San Onofre. It was all done under the table, ex parte, illegal, just plain, you know, illegal. And it is curious that on the same day that deal was cut, that kind of money came into the California Democratic Party. So, you know, and Jerry promised when they were going to make the public announcement about shutting the place down that he was going to, this is according to, you know, emails between a former PG&E lobbyist and his boss. He was basically going to say that he agreed with the way everything was being handled by Edison and that they were doing everything correctly and it was all right. And they were taking the right decisions and everything else. And it's shocking because that whole fiasco is a very murky one with Southern California Edison and San Onofre and what happened with those generators, the steam leaks that sprang because the contractor on the steam generators could not guarantee that the design was going to be completely foolproof. And I believe Edison was aware of this and went ahead anyway because it was a way to save money. They didn't want to have to submit, as I understand it, a completely new design for these reactors because it would mean re-permitting, right, with the NRC, and they wanted to avoid that. Again, it's always follow the money,
And that's how they got them in the end, because they did not do that. I fought that fight back. I'm a little bit murky on the details, but we were very instrumental in closing down San Onofre. And I also think that Ray Lutz and his Citizens Oversight Committee was instrumental in getting that decision of putting the ratepayers on the hook for the decommissioning, right? Isn't it going to be the shareholders now?
It should be the shareholders. I mean, this is an outrage. We're looking at putting $3.3 billion onto the ratepayers out of a total of $4.7 billion. How is it fair to put almost 70% of the cost of this thing onto the ratepayers? It's an outrage, and it was done under the table in the dark. And then it was so curious because, the PUC, they did all kinds of things, those judges, on behalf of Southern California Edison, including they canceled the last phase of a public investigation. And they canceled that last phase into that issue of who was responsible. What happened exactly with those actors, and why did they fail, and who was responsible for all of that? That they simply just canceled.
Yeah, how convenient. Yeah.
How convenient was that, And so, they're all working in tandem. And you've got, this public interest attorney, Mike Aguirre, former city attorney for San Diego, trying now to get the emails that have obviously gone down between the governor's office, possibly the governor himself, and Mike Picker, who's the current president of the PUC. And mind you, just so that we all know, this is really now the Brown Utility Commission. Some people call it the Brown Utility Commission, but I mean, if you now look at the composition of the thing, you have 5 commissioners, all of whom were either former close top aides or appointees of his to various agencies. Okay, so Leanne Randolph was an appointee of his to the Department of Natural Resources. I believe it was the Department of Natural Resources. She had a hand in the firing of those 2 regulators. She was present for some of the conversations and screaming matches and all the rest of it between the governor's office, between Cliff Rechtschaffen and these guys. Cliff Rechtschaffen was that top aide on oil and gas who fired the regulators. Mike Picker was a friend of, by the way, Susan Kennedy's, and also, I guess that goes back to McFadden, which I can talk about in a minute. But, he was also top aide of Brown's on quote unquote renewable energy. So now he's the president of the commission. In fact, he was put in by Brown to take the place of PV, who had to resign under a cloud, and then quickly became the president.
Isn't he still being investigated?
Well,
isn't he still...
that, no. I mean, I don't know. I certainly hope that he is, but my impression is that that investigation was begun by Kamala Harris and actually started to yield something. And the minute that it did, she dialed back on it. And I think she dialed back on it because she was already thinking about her future, her political future, and she probably didn't want to piss off Jerry because she needed his endorsement. And so my thinking on this whole thing is, as Attorney General, she slow-walked some things, and I think she slow-walked Peavy. Now, I hope that Becerra is continuing that investigation because I think it's really, really, really important, but I don't know that that's happening.
I wouldn't hold your breath.
I'm sorry, don't hold your breath.
Hold your breath that Becerra is going to represent the people and not the corporations.
No, it's a very convenient foil right now. Donald Trump is a brilliant foil because everybody can say, that's the battle. And it just refocuses. So, you know, Becerra's fighting Trump and Brown is fighting Trump and everybody's fighting Trump.
Right. Meanwhile,
the
everything, the corporation is pillaging. Yeah.
And as far as, you know, you brought up McFadden and all the rest of it. I mean, you know, all these people go way back. Susan Kennedy worked for Davis. She was then appointed by Davis to the PUC. She arranged for Nancy to get a job at PG&E. How convenient. So Nancy goes to PG&E. Susan Kennedy's on the PUC. Okay, then Brown comes in. Kennedy recommends, actually had recommended Michael Picker, who's the current president of the PUC, as a top aide.
They're all corrupt. It's a revolving door. And I want to briefly go through your 2 other reports. I want you to tell us about the conclusions of the power play report.
Kathleen Brown has done very well. She's on the board of Sempra Energy, and she's been paid about $1.1 million for her board work. And under her guidance, that company has done extraordinarily well with the administration. So they've gotten about more than $4 billion worth of contracts for more fossil fuel power plants that we don't need, that are going to make sure that San Diego has, you know, more than half idle capacity by the time all that's done. We don't need to be spending that kind of money. There's a problem writ large in the state with that, and we should be transitioning off, but we're not. So she, you know, that's happened sort of on her watch. Sempra has applied to build a gigantic pipeline for natural gas that we don't need when there are already existing pipelines in the region. And it's all about the fact that they want to start exporting liquid natural gas. There's going to be a big demand for it in Asia. There's no demand for it here. They have an import terminal they can't do anything with that's on the Mexican border. They want to convert it to an export facility. And, you know, essentially it's like they want the public to pay for it. They want the ratepayers to pay for a pipeline that's going to benefit the shareholders. It's as simple as that. That's in process. It's only about halfway through, but it looks like in all of the hearings at the PUC is sympathetic towards the company on that one. So again, you know, that's another example. And so the company has just done extraordinarily well. Aliso Canyon, the company got that thing reopened by the PUC and Dogger without ever revealing the root cause of what caused the biggest blowout of a methane well in U.S. history. You know, no cause, no responsibility taken by anybody, and no effort to make somebody take the responsibility, and yet they allowed that to reopen. Again, that's a commercial facility. Refineries, you know, buy the gas at a low price and then use it in their operations or sell it at a high price. We don't know how much of that facility is used for commercial purposes, but we know a lot of it is. And that's never been revealed because it's a trade secret. And again, it's the ratepayers that are paying tens of millions of dollars to maintain it. And that's exactly what the company wants ratepayers to have to continue to do. And it looks like the PUC is all too willing to help.
The liquefied natural gas thing I didn't know about. I don't think it's on the radar of any environmental organization, at least the ones that I get the emails from, because we've been fighting these LNG terminals all over the country. And I had no idea until I read your report that they're actually doing one here and it's halfway in process. So I want to see if anyone's on that, and if not, maybe I'll get on that, because that's a horrible thing.
Well, I'm happy to, yeah. I mean, the problem is, you know, at the moment, it's a big, long proceeding, and I don't think the PUC is going to make a decision about it until sometime next year. And so it's not on anybody's radar because there's not like a hard hook, but it's outrageous what's going on. I mean, the Sempra lawyers they tried to lie to the, you know, various interveners about how it was so speculative. And then it turned out that on their own website, there's all this information about how they already got the permits from the Mexican government. You know, they have a subsidiary in Mexico that's big in to all sorts of energy projects down there. So they've already put in all the permits and gotten the permissions. And, you know, it's just unbelievable. It's like, and they just want to, you know, socialize the costs and privatize the profits. I mean, it's just as clear as day. And see, the whole thing about this is electricity and natural gas, our electricity demand is flat. And our natural gas demand is going to be falling like 1.5% a year over year. We just don't need all of this centralized infrastructure. And the reason that we've got it going is because that's a cash cow. These companies have an enormously high rate of return that the PUC allows them to get away with. The PUC does not sanction them for anything, including these horrible wildfires now where people have died. And, so it goes. And they just get to keep raising rates. So, you just pointed that out at the beginning of the conversation. Every couple of years they come in for a new cycle of rate hikes, and they inevitably get them.
Now, this is also happening with the DWP here in Los Angeles, and you were at an action to fight the rate hikes because of the tunnels,
Right.
which looks like we may be making some progress on. The Santa Clara Water District last night just voted that they're only going to pay a certain number of millions, and they only want one tunnel. So now they're going to have to go back to the drawing board, and hopefully we can extend this thing until Brown's out of office, because this is one of his legacy projects. And we know that this is just a water grab for big oil and big ag that the ratepayers in Southern California are going to be paying for.
Correct.
So
that's exactly right.
Now, getting back to the energy, though, because that's a water story. We were talking about in the beginning of the show how the mainstream corporate media has really fallen down on the job in terms of reporting these things. But with one exception, the LA Times did a great investigative piece on how we have overbuilt the capacity of these natural gas plants in the state of California. And that reporting actually led to some municipalities rejecting additional plants. So can you talk about that series? Did that surprise you? And also, since you're a journalist yourself, how have you seen the state of journalism, specifically environmental reporting, specifically investigative reporting, as the newspaper business has been decimated itself by the internet?
Well, look, I think that, you've got, first of all, definitely kudos to Ivan Penn. He's really been doing some great work at the LA Times, and it's really heartening to see. He's done a number of different pieces about overcapacity. I myself found in my own reporting, by counting it up, that on Brown's watch, we built or green-lighted 15 natural gas power plants, 15 since 2011. It's billions of dollars worth. And we've built in triple what the state requires is some extra margin in case of an emergency. We have nearly triple that now. And according to Ivan's reporting, we're going to be generating like 21% more, electricity than we can possibly use in the next 4 or 5 years. So, but he's done other great stories too, about stranded assets and how we're stuck paying for those when projects go south, et cetera. So, I'm happy about that. And I think that, it's very important that somebody's doing it. Obviously, there are specialized outfits that are able to do some of this investigative reporting that others can't anymore, right? Like the Center for Public Integrity, or like the, ProPublica and so on. So, there are pockets of sanctuaries where some of this stuff continues. I think that this newspaper business has so shredded itself in terms of what became of the LA Times, for the profit motive, and just cut. And, now journalists are supposed to do everything, not just write their print stories, but they're supposed to blog. If you're a radio reporter, you're supposed to wear a video camera on your head, and do that too. And then also blog it and tweet it. And, there's social media and all the rest of it. You've got to Facebook it, whatever. People are just overwhelmed. They're overworked. Their pay is not great. That everything's getting worse. People are fearful for jobs. I think there's also definitely, and I don't really know quite why this is, but sort of a fear of litigation. And I think sometimes journalists look at people like me who are, advocates, they feel that they somehow have to re-report the wheel, So if I've looked at all the behested payments to X politician, and I write a press release about pointing out some angle, like Garcetti taking a bunch of money from, the wonderful company, and then shutting up on the Delta tunnels instead of taking a strong position until the very last minute, a reporter will say to me, well, I can't just report what you say. I might get in trouble, and, we'll get sued, and then, my publication will be shut down. I literally had somebody say that to me that shall remain nameless.
Yeah, you told me when that happened.
Our study thing, and that just astonished me. I mean, I can provide the download of all of the reports. It's like they're public, and I can help by just speeding the process up and handing somebody what I've downloaded. And I don't understand that attitude, but it's very fragmented. And I think another thing I would say about California that I find highly disturbing is that it's very parochial in this and fragmented in the sense that you cannot pitch a story about Southern California to the San Francisco Chronicle, and you can't pitch a story about the Chevron refinery in Richmond to the LA Times. Nobody wants to do anything unless it's right in their backyard, and what they don't do is they don't connect the dots. It's a pattern. The stuff that's happening down here often has a counterpart someplace else because it's a part of a larger policy. Yeah. And so, but somehow those dots never get connected. And it's almost as if people don't treat California as sort of one state. It's almost like treated as though it's just kind of different little parts. And it's covered that way now. It's really fractured. And I don't understand that either. I mean, it's the fifth, I think, or sixth largest economy in the world. Right. And yet those things aren't connected.
Eric Brooks is someone I work with, the California Clean Energy Coalition. We got together to fight Steve Bradford's bill, AB, I forget the name of it, but Steve Bradford, another one of these oily Democrats, who wanted to turn community choice aggregation into an opt-in program, which actually would have killed it. And we were able to fight him. And Scott Wetch, who is one of the most powerful lobbyists in Sacramento, represents both the utility industry and the unions, the IBEW, who are oftentimes in league on these issues. And community choice aggregation is the ability for municipalities to band together, form a nonprofit, and buy wind and solar power directly from the producer. Now, you still need the utilities because they still need to transmit the power and they still need to bill the customers. But what you're able to do is you're able to get more green power for less money. And this is one of our big success stories in the state. We were able to fight off that bill and then another bill that he did this year. And we were able to get, thanks to Joe Galliani, who just retired in his 60th birthday for the year of Joe. But basically, he organized the entire South Bay into a CCA and organized the county of LA is they're going to have their own CCA. And what Eric Brooks is asking is this. He says the Utility Reform Network, TURN, has been in bed with the monopoly utilities, which it's supposed to be watchdogging since the mid-90s when they supported Enron and PG&E's bogus electricity deregulation scheme. Now TURN is writing and supporting state legislation that attacks community choice energy programs under the pretense of protecting consumers, when in fact it delivers, well, as I said, will Consumer Watchdog join with groups like Californians for Energy Choice and Food and Water Watch to form a real grassroots coalition to protect consumers and the environment, a coalition that will replace TURN and its corruption and cozy relationships with the fossil fuel energy-based monopoly utilities? So there's a question inviting you to do something. What do you think?
Well, I like the idea. I'll certainly take it back to my colleagues. I'm all for CCAs. I think it's an excellent idea for a lot of reasons. I think that the unions, the IBEW, I think they don't understand what the hell's going on. I don't understand why they look at this whole movement to decentralize and green our energy as a threat, because that is going to create jobs. That's number one. Number two, it also, builds, it gets at the idea of making a faster transition to a greener grid, which can only be good on every single level. Plus, these technologies are really getting a lot more competitive. I mean, it's not like you're going to be spending more money. It really reminds me of the breakup of AT&T. I don't know if you remember MCI. It was like it was the first was the first company on the block to challenge AT&T, and basically forced AT&T to allow them to use the telephone lines to provide their own service. And this is exactly the same things. The CCAs forcing the utilities to open up their transmission lines so that they can be used to then allow communities to either purchase or create and own their own sources of power. And I cannot think of a better way to insulate ourselves and become more sustainable than doing that, than decentralizing. That is clearly the way to go from the point of view of national security. I mean, think about it. A terrorist can much more easily target a San Onofre than some tiny little, than a windmill. I mean, to me, it just makes perfect, beautiful sense. And so, yes, it's sad that there are some groups that support the wrong things, and I think it has to do with probably the way things are set up in terms of intervening in proceedings and where your money's coming from and a whole lot of other complicated issues. And it isn't every group that gets to be completely independent of that kind of process.
Yeah.
So
well, it was
that's
really
part of
sad to me when I went to testify in favor of the fracking moratorium resolution in Carson, and Maria Elena Durazo, who was at the time the executive secretary of the LA County Fed, which is the local version of the AFL-CIO. They have 54 unions. She bussed in 500 workers. They were all wearing shirts that said "Jobs for Carson," Teamsters and IBEW people mostly, to speak against the fracking moratorium resolution. And this was Occidental, again, wanted to build 200 new wells. This is in a low-income, working-class community of color, where they're already inundated with these toxic projects. And none of the jobs, first of all, there were only 34 permanent jobs. None of them would have gone to residents of Carson because they would have brought in people from Texas and North Dakota. And none of them were even unionized jobs. And here she was, literally sitting next to, I forget his name, but he was like the $1,000 an hour lawyer for Occidental. There was Maria Elena Durazo sitting right next to him in league, with the enemy. And so I'm very skeptical about unions. I think the concept of unions are great, but I've been on the opposite side of unions enough times to know that, sometimes they're not representing working people in general. So I want to thank you very much for being on the show tonight. Your wealth of information. I want people to share the show with their friends, especially people who think Jerry Brown is such a climate leader and such a saint. I mean, this really shows how the revolving door works, how money in politics works, how the fox is guarding the hen house, regulatory capture. I mean, all of that, the Democratic Party is corrupt. All of this is happening right here in California, considered one of the most progressive states in the country. I want to close this show, thank my guest, Liza Tucker, and tell you all what I always say, which is keep fighting, because we can win. We had two great wins this week. Jerry Brown vetoed SB 649, which would have placed a cell phone tower every fifth home on our streets. And Ventura rejected a natural gas plant. So thank you very much and keep fighting.